What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Making the Game from Concept to Kickstarter. I am your host, Reece, and in this podcast, we talk about the process of making a tabletop game, going from initial ideas through development, crowdfunding, then into production, distribution, and more. In this episode of the podcast, we're going to continue our in-depth series. This time, we're going to talk about one of the skill class archetypes, and in this instance, it will be the Warlord. In the previous podcast, we talked about one of the arcane classes, the Wizards, the Dread Mage, and that went over really well. So I thought we would continue the trend and talk about the third archetype of classes, the skill-based classes. The skill-based classes were really interesting. In the development process, they initially felt like the hardest ones to do because they're the least... they have the least cohesion between them, right? With martial classes, it's very straightforward. You know, they fight physically. You've got your fighter, your ranger, your rogue, your barbarian. And anybody who's familiar with RPGs, I don't really have to even explain too much. They know exactly kind of intuitively what those do. And similar with the arcane classes, you know, they use magic, and there's some tropes within that, like the priest, you know, is going to be healing people, probably buffing, things of this nature. The druid's going to have nature magic. So the skill-based classes, while individually they can be really familiar, such as the Bard. Anybody who's familiar with fantasy gaming knows Bard uses music. And if you've played like D&D or Pathfinder, they have like magical abilities for a fantasy setting. They're not literally just a minstrel playing a lute or something to that effect. They do have some kind of metaphysical abilities. The alchemist is usually pretty straightforward too. They have, you know, bombs and potions and poison, things of this nature that they can create and throw. And for us, we also have the Inquisitor and the Warlord, which are in the skill archetype. And the Warlord is the one that we're going to focus on. You could probably guess, you know, they are a leader type class, you know, pretty close to being a warrior themselves. But the problem was in finding the thread that unified the skill-based classes, because they all kind of have like a little shtick. They do something that other classes don't do. They do something that's unique to them. For example, the Bard plays music, and in Bloodthrone they have shouts too, kind of like in Skyrim, where they have like magical like yelling abilities, for lack of a better description, that are their offensive abilities. And while they each have this kind of like unique thing that they do, the fact that it is unique means it's kind of difficult to unify them. So throughout the development process, they initially were the hardest, the most challenging classes to work on. But then towards the end of the process, they began to be my favorite classes to work on, because you weren't shoehorned in as much as you would be with, you know, kind of a classic wizard or a warrior type class, where it's like people come in with expectations of what they're going to do, and you don't want to deviate too far from that, because it will be unsettling. Like, of course, there's room for creativity, and once we get into the hero expansion, we really start to get creative with it. The skill-based classes, as we started moving through the process, really felt fun. I started to look forward to them because it was like, oh man, you can do whatever you want, right? Like, had a lot of flexibility. So before I go too far into it, Bloodthrone is still available to be backed on GameFound. Just go over to GameFound in the backer kit, in the pledge manager, excuse me, and just do a search for Bloodthrone: The Tower of Sacrifice. To everybody that's backed it so far, thank you so much. And as a general update too, I plan on Friday of this week. Today is the 12th of November. And I'm planning on Friday of this week to do a general update. We did hit some delays. I'll go into depth on that. And the delays aren't because there was only one thing that was a curveball for us, which was the internal organizer tray. I did not realize that would take as long as it would. Obviously, it's really important though to keep the game organized so it's not just full of random bits. But really the delays that we've been facing are because we've been increasing the quality of the game. We've been we added literally hundreds of pieces of art that took us almost the entire year to do. So all the cards now have art, and we added a lot of art into the books as well, because the cards getting art made the whole program, it slowed the whole thing down. And so in that interim, I was like, well, I might as well have the art studio that we work with make some more art, because they don't have anything else to do to make the book look better. So I'll go into depth in that on Friday. I'll make a podcast to accommodate the general update as well. But we are facing some delays. It's not like crazy, anything crazy. I think we're going to be a couple months late, which still is frustrating because I really wanted to deliver the first one on time. However, I think the increase in quality should offset the delay. At any rate, back on to the primary topic. So skill classes are in between Martial and Arcane. So Arcane classes, they're your wizards. They have lower HP, but they have some of their special defenses are higher. So as a quick reminder, every hero has 3 defenses. Every monster as well has 3 defenses. They have evasion, which is like armor class. If you play D&D, it's like your kind of your catch-all defense. It's the default defense. And then special attacks, special actions will typically target will or fortitude. Will is for things that attack your mind or your spirit. Fortitude is for your body. Like a poison attack would usually attack fortitude, and then like charm would attack your will defense. So arcane classes tend to have higher special defenses, but lower physical defenses, lower HP. But they have the most powerful special abilities, which you would assume would be the case. They have spells, typically long range, typically long lasting, typically high damage, typically can affect multiple targets. That's to offset their lower physical abilities. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have martial classes, which have very high mundane defenses, high HP, high evasion. They usually have high fortitude as well. They have really good skills, but they're usually short range, short duration, and they really focus on going forward and beating you up in physical combat, or in the case of the ranger, doing it from long range. Skill classes are split the difference between the two. So the warlord within the skill class umbrella leans much more towards a martial class. Like they're like a baby martial class. And what differentiates them from all the other skill classes or all the other classes in general is their shtick, right? Like their special thing that they do is they issue commands. Whereas like the bard plays songs and has shouts. That's something that only the bard does in the core box. Excuse me. The warlord has commands, right? So they're like a leadership-based class. They're also like, out of all the classes in the game, they're like the next best in combat. Like you can build a warlord with a ton of options. You can make them like an off tank, or like you can have them dual wield. You can give them a bow. They're very flexible in the way you want to kit them out. But commands is their bread and butter. That's like the thing that they do. And the way commands are implemented in the game from a mechanics point of view is they use shout actions. So shout actions we've covered briefly. The fighter has a shout action, taunt. The barbarian has shout actions as well. Shout actions like mechanically function almost identically to spells in that they use the metaphysics action modifier, and they'll target usually will, sometimes like fortitude. And it's like a verbal command that's not a spell. Now to differentiate them from casting actions are almost always a standard action, or they can be a ritual for really powerful spells, or a ritual that take up your whole turn. Casting actions you can move and cast with the mobile casting special rule. Shouts, on the other hand, almost always use your simple action. So as a quick refresher, every hero has 2 standard actions and 1 simple action. For anybody who's played like D&D, it's familiar. A lot of RPGs use that basic framework. So the simple action is kind of like an in-between action. It's like a half action. I think that's what they actually used to call it in D&D. And you can only use 1 simple action per activation, but it doesn't eat into your 2 standard actions. So the warlord, who can function pretty normally like a combat character, is really leaning into that simple action to issue commands. So that's kind of like their shtick, and I'll dig into all of the details of that as we go. So like again, the difference between a shout and a casting action, like when you're rolling the dice, it's very similar, but then in terms of action economy, they're different. We did that so that they felt different, so that like the warlord didn't feel like he was just kind of like a wizard with makeup on. He plays very differently, or she plays very differently on the table versus a wizard that's going to be using their actions in a much different method on the tabletop. So again, when you're building your party, you're always going to be taking 2 martial, 2 skill, and 2 arcane classes. We did this for balance purposes. And you have a total roster of 12 heroes, 4 are martial, 4 are skill, 4 are arcane. And you're always going to be choosing 2 from each of those archetypes when you're building your party. And what this means is, again, as a quick refresher, if a hero gets knocked out in a game, they're unavailable in the next game, or if they go 2 games in a row, 2 missions in a row, they have to rest and they won't be available for the third. So you're always mixing it up. You're not going to be taking the exact same combo of heroes every time. You're always changing things up. So not only does that keep it fresh, you're not just defaulting to always using the same hero. You're going to be forced to change it up if you're playing with lots of people, or if you're playing solo or in PvP. You can't just rely on the copy paste exact same thing over and over again. But it also adds another layer of strategic depth. So when you're playing in the campaign, you have to be really selective of like, okay, when do I want to use these heroes? If I'm doing a side quest, it's not as challenging. I'm going to use some of the heroes that I haven't been using to give them more XP, but also to make sure I don't get any of my favorite heroes injured for one of the plot missions, which are more difficult and critical to progressing through the campaign. And then obviously in PvP, you have to be selective in when you use any combination of heroes, because it's always a risk. If you go into a game and use them, you might not be able to use them in the next game. Okay, for equipment restrictions, skill-based classes, they're pretty unique. Like martial classes, like paradoxically have the most options for equipment and often the most restrictions. And what I mean by that is martial classes by default can use any equipment except for class-specific equipment. For example, only the bard can take an instrument. You can't give some bongos to your fighter, as funny as that would be. And then there's arcane-specific equipment, which we've covered, which are like the wand and the arcane staff and the arcane focus. So martial characters can take everything, but they often have very specific restrictions on equipment because in order to define the class, the best example is the ranger. The ranger has to take they have to take a ranged weapon in their main hand. We do that so that you don't have a ranger that's got like a sword and a shield and no ranged weapon, which would be silly. Now, of course, a ranger in reality could do that if they wanted to, but in a class-based, party-based game, we wanted each class to have a very clearly defined role and it to be visually reflected on their model to make it easy to identify what was going on. So martial characters starting out have the widest breadth of equipment options, but often have the most restrictions. Arcane classes have the most restrictions to start with, but they don't really care because they're relying on their spells. The skill-based classes they're right in the middle. So by default, they can use all the equipment in the game, except again, class-specific equipment and arcane equipment, and they cannot take the heaviest equipment, which is restricted to martial classes. So what I mean by that is with a skill-based class, you couldn't take an arbalist, for example, which is a very heavy crossbow. It's the kind that winds up, for any history nerds, you put it down on the ground, you wind it up, fires a very heavy bolt. But they could take a crossbow or a light crossbow. Skill-based classes can't take heavy armor, but they can take medium or light armor. They can't take a heavy shield, but they can take a medium or light shield, example, et cetera, et cetera. They could take a pike, which is like a medium, or it's like a normal two-handed weapon, but they couldn't take a great axe, for example, just to illustrate the way that works. Now, on the flip side is skill-based classes typically don't have that many restrictions. So in effect, you can build them in a wide variety of ways. Look, for the Warlord example, you could give them no armor or light armor and give them a longbow or a crossbow. And now they're like a mini ranger. Or you could give them medium armor, a shield, and a hand weapon. They're like a mini fighter. Or you could go light or medium armor and 2 hand weapons, and they're kind of like a mini barbarian. So you have a ton of flexibility. And we'll go into it when we talk about these classes specifically, but some skill classes function more like an arcane class in regards to the way that their special ability manifests. Like the alchemist is the best example. The alchemist is throwing bombs and potions and poisons. And so even though they're not spells, mechanically they are kind of similar to spells. So the skill classes that have these really powerful offensive abilities, we often mechanically will make them use up one of their hand slots, usually their main hand, to take a tool. And a tool is something that it logically explains how they're doing what they're doing. Like the bard must take an instrument in their main hand. So it's like, you know, you can take whatever you want. Visually, it can be whatever you want. It could be a drum, it could be flute, it could be a lyre, like whatever. Mechanically, what it does is it prevents you from taking a bard that has like a sword and a shield, because that would look kind of silly. So visually, it kind of shows you like how they're doing the thing that they're doing, but it also offsets the power of their core ability, right? The Warlord doesn't have that. The Warlord has no restrictions whatsoever on equipment within the skill archetype framework. So you have a ton of options. You can really, really go crazy with the Warlord. It's like Warlord and the Inquisitor, you can go bananas. Like there's so many options available to you for the way you want them to look, for the kind of equipment they have. And as the Warlord's, you know, shtick is issuing commands, but they're inherently limited because it's a simple action. They're really basically like they're like a mini warrior with extra cool abilities, right? That's the way that they manifest on the tabletop. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into the abilities for the Warlord. So their class ability, which again, your class ability is automatically put into the deck for that hero. It doesn't take up one of your skill slots, is Move with Haste, and it's freaking amazing. So it's a free action. So this means it does not take up any of your action economy. We did this so that the Warlord could always issue 2 commands per turn. One of them is always going to be Move with Haste. You don't have a choice, but once I explain what it does, you always want to use it. And then the other one is of any of the other commands that they have that become available to them over the course of the game. So Move with Haste, short range, and it gives an allied model, meaning the Warlord can't do it to themselves. It gives an allied model the hasted status effect, which gives them an extra standard action. It's amazing, right? So in a game that's limited to 6 turns in almost all cases, there's some scenarios that go beyond that in PvE. Getting 1 extra action per turn basically gives you 10% more actions than you would have otherwise had. So I don't think I need to explain why that's so good. It's extremely powerful. So just bear in mind, it is short range. At level 4, you can take a feat called Reaching Commands that increases up to medium range. So if you have a Warlord that's not getting up in the mix that wants to hang back a little bit, that's a really good choice. And then of course, at level 6, you have a class feat called Blitzkrieg that lets you issue Move with Haste to 2 allies. You can haste 2 allies. It does stun the Warlord in order to compensate for the power of it. But if you have a Warlord, again, that's like sitting back and shooting once you're in a good position, you're losing 1 action for yourself in order to give two allies an extra action. Like giving Kijo and Dalnan, for example, an extra action is amazing, right? So that might be a trade-off that you're willing to make. Anyway, it's an amazing ability. It's the defining ability of the Warlord. From a lore perspective, they're identifying an opening in the enemy's lines, and they're telling one of their key warriors like, "Hey, get in there and kick some butt." The primary skill tree for the Warlord is action manipulation. Their class ability reflects this. So much like crowd control, which is the Dread Mage's primary focus, action manipulation or action economy is really, really powerful. So typically in any faction, there's going to be a limited amount of access to these skill sets. Warlord specializes in it, and as we go through this, you'll see how many ways they have to increase actions on your side, decrease actions on the other side, make things happen out of the normal action sequence. It's a really fun class, much like the Dread Mage. It's a high skill cap class, and I think people will really, it might be a little intimidating at first because they're more complex than, say, the Fighter, but once you start to realize all the things you can do, the Warlord quickly becomes like, in playtesting, it quickly became one of people's favorite classes, and it felt indispensable often. So at level 1, you have the option to take Halt. Halt is the inverse of Move with Haste. It's medium range, it targets will, and it stuns an allied model. Now again, you're using it as a simple action. You can only do 1 of these orders because it's a simple action, but because Move with Haste is a free action, and then like Halt would be a simple action, in the same turn, you can give your side 1 action and take an action away from the other side. It's really good. I don't think I need to explain how good this is. And then at level 8, you have a feat upgrade that lets you try to halt 2 enemy models. If you do so, you do so with disadvantage. But obviously, that is really, really strong. and disadvantage increases the likelihood of the ability failing. At level 6, you get Steal Momentum, very strong class ability. What this does is, this is a once per game ability because it is so powerful. It stuns an enemy model and then takes that action and gives it to an allied model. So again, it's a 2-action swing. You're taking one away from the opponent and giving it to one of your allies. Obviously very good. At level 10, the ultimate ability for the Warlord is called Art of War. It's incredible. It's a ritual action, meaning the Warlord won't be able to do any other standard actions, but it gives everyone on your team haste. Don't think that it needs much explanation. You're getting potentially 7 additional actions in one activation. So, and what I mean by that is like 6 for all your teammates and 1 for a summon that you may have in play. The Warlord's secondary skill tree is buffs, and they have some really, really strong buffs. All the Warlord buffs last only 1 turn. They're called inspirations. 1 turn, but strong. And again, this is a simple action. So it's not interrupting the Warlord's own action economy. So level 1, you get Strike with Might. It's really, really good. This gives you Panoptic and +1 advantage. We've already talked about advantages, but really quickly, they let you manipulate an action roll after you roll the dice. So it's like you roll, it's like, oh, I had a critical failure, I can ignore that. Oh, I had a critical success, I can activate that. There's lots of things you can do with it. I won't rehash it too much in depth. It's very good. And then Panoptic is a really strong inspiration, and it gives the affected allied model 360-degree line of sight while they are the active model. So what that means is you can attack someone that's behind you. Now, you still have to rotate to put the target model within your action arc. Action arc is 90 degrees forward, and that rotation is free. It's a part of the action, right? So what this does is if there's a model behind, like say for example, Grey Wolf is the best example. Say someone has gotten behind Grey Wolf, your ranger. Normally, Grey Wolf would have to use an action to turn to see the enemy model and then use another action to shoot him. With Panoptic, since you now have 360-degree line of sight, you rotate to get them in your action arc and shoot them all as 1 action, right? So it's basically like giving hasted in the right circumstances, but also if you put it on a model like the Barbarian, who or the Ranger also, who have melee actions that can attack in a 360-degree arc. They attack every model that was within the range of their melee weapons. Obviously, giving them 360-degree line of sight, it potentially can double the amount of models that you could affect. So it's very strong. And then with a feat upgrade, you can also give it +1 power, which allows you to do more damage. Obviously, that's at level 4. It's called Skillful Commands. That's reaching commands. At level 4, lets you increase the range to medium range. I apologize. And then at level 6, you can do Skillful Commands, which has the target model and the Warlord gain the benefit of the command. So clearly, if you have a Warlord that's going to be geared up for melee, that could be a sick combo, right? You give it to an ally and yourself, you're doubling the benefit you gain from that one command. It's very strong. And then if you want to have a sit back and shoot style Warlord, reaching commands at level 4 may be the better choice, because you can give it to someone while you're kind of back from the front line, not in as much danger. At level 2, the Warlord gains the Brace Yourself command. And this is kind of the opposite of Strike with Might. This is a defensive buff. It's very strong. So this gives you the armored and defense inspirations. Again, inspiration lasts for 1 turn. Armor gives you +1 damage reduction, which takes away 1 die from the damage dice pool anytime that model gets hit. It's really strong. And then defense gives you +2 to evasion, will, and fortitude. And it also gives you 360-degree line of sight while you are not the active model, which means on the defense, you can't get hit in the back, which is huge in Bloodthrone. So if a model attacks you in the back, not only do they get +1 advantage, you can't block, parry, dodge, or resist the action. So model positioning is like the key to high level play in Bloodthrone. And if something gets behind you, it could be devastating. It's oftentimes, especially in PvP, it's like you're done for. So having the ability to get eyes in the back of your head, so to speak, when you're on defense means that you can try to dodge, you can try to block, parry, or whatever, they don't get +1 advantage. It's really strong. And of course, +2 to all your defenses is huge. And +1 damage reduction is great. It's a very, very strong defensive buff. Really good, like especially on like the Barbarian, because the Barbarian tends to go in and get like surrounded by enemies. It's really good. You could put it on someone like Ajax, the fighter, who's already really hard to hit. It makes him even harder to hit. And then he goes from damage reduction 3 to 4, which is nuts. That means like a lot of the time, monsters will be doing like 1 or 2 damage dice on him. So it makes your tank just even tankier. So really good ability. And this has the same feat upgrades available to it as Strike with Might does. Reaching commands makes it go to medium range, which doubles the range. And then skillful commands means that you can have it affect yourself in addition to the target model. At level 4, you get one of my favorite abilities. It's called Alter Formation. Alter Formation is one of those abilities that's so useful that I'm not going to like talk your ear off about it, but it lets 2 allied models in range of the ability switch places, so they swap squares without triggering attacks of opportunity. An attack of opportunity, normally when you leave engagement, the engaging model gets a free hit on you, but when you're moved involuntarily, it doesn't happen. So this is crazy good. So let's say you have one of your wizards, a monster's on them, and you're like, oh, that's not good. They're going to get killed. You could have them swap with a melee character, and now all of a sudden the monster's like, oh, crap, now I'm going to get killed. There's just 1,000,001 ways to use this ability. It's really, really versatile. As a simple action, it's ridiculously versatile, right? Like I use this one a lot. This one may end up being borderline OP. I'll be really interested to get some feedback. I felt like it was like flirting with it. But once people are playing the game and it's out there in the wild, I'll be interested to get feedback on this one specifically. But a mitigating factor is that it is a short range ability, so the Warlord has to be close. At level 8, you get one of the most baller abilities. It's called Charge. It's once per game because it's so strong. But what this does is it lets you, so you use the charge ability on an ally, and they immediately make an out of sequence charge action. So it is short range, which does mitigate it, but this is obviously like this is crazy. So if you have like Kijo, for example, in position to just like go bananas, you pop it, goes in, probably kills something, and it's a free charge action, which is not only an extra attack, it's also extra movement. So really, really, really strong. Everybody's level 8 ability is really strong, and almost always they're once per game, or very commonly they're once per game because they're so good. But it's just, this is one of those abilities, it's not only it's good, it's fun. In PvE, you can use it to go take out a monster, finish one off, or get further back. You can also get closer to an objective. But in PvP particularly, it's worth it just to see the look on your opponent's face when they're like, oh no. But again, in PvP, this is going to be one of those abilities that they're going to be looking to try and stop with a counter ability. Speaking of counter abilities, the tertiary skill tree for the Warlord is counters. And now counters, as I have said numerous times, they're the most powerful abilities in the game because they stop other abilities. And when you successfully use a counter, an active counter, not only does it stop the ability, it also like it treats the ability as having failed, right? It's like as if they tried to do it and they failed their action roll. So it's like a stun as well. Like you're taking an action away and you're stopping them from using one of their key abilities. So because counters are so powerful, the way we design the factions is that there's very limited access to these. The Inquisitor is the counter specialist. That's their primary focus. That's why I would argue that the Inquisitor is the most powerful character in the game, even though it doesn't really do a ton of damage. Stopping other abilities totally changes the flow of the game. So whereas the Inquisitor can counter any special ability in the game, that's typically any ability that has a card or that's listed under special abilities for monsters. The Warlord is limited to physical actions. So all special actions in the game are either physical or metaphysical. And if you look in the upper right corner of the card, it'll either be a little meditating guy floating, which is metaphysical, or a little guy lifting up a rock, which is physical. That'll tell you what kind of counter ability they are susceptible to. And as we go through the game, there will be some classes that can counter metaphysical abilities. For example, in the hero expansion, the Transmuter can counter metaphysical abilities. So they can't counter physical abilities like like a special charge attack or something like that that can counter spells. But the Warlord, being not a magical class, they're a physical class, they can stop someone from doing a physical ability, right? So we did that to kind of to make access to counters not feel oppressive. Because while I think it's critical, I think it's extremely important from a game design perspective to have counters in the game. You really don't want to have too many of them because it's just not fun when you're just not able to do what you want to do. So typically speaking, like the Warlord, for example, this is once per activation, you could try to stop someone from doing a physical ability. The Inquisitor can get up to 2 at high level, but that's it, right? So it's still really good. And it, like in PvP, if you take the Warlord and the Inquisitor, you can really mess up the monster's plans in PvE. Or like I said, in PvP, you can really mess up your opponent's plans. So really strong. And then at level 8, you can upgrade the ability to treat swirls on the action dice as successes or explosions. That increases your ability to stop, to use the counter successfully by quite a bit. And then at level 2, you can also just get +1 to denial for the Warlord to make them even better at this ability. Speaking of which, we'll jump into the class feats for the Warlord. So again, as a quick refresher, there are general feats that are available to all classes at level 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9. Although at level 5 and level 9 is a stat boost point, so you just pick one of your stats that hasn't been boosted to give it +1. And at 1, 3, and 7, you have general feats. At 2, 4, 6, 8, you have class feats that are unique to each class. There is some overlap though, like some class feats are the same between classes, but it's pretty rare. So at level 2, we already covered skillful counters, which is +1 denial. Denial is what you use to try and stop other people from using their abilities. Predictable outcome is the other option. Predictable outcome it's really strong. It's if any model, friend or foe within medium range has a critical hit and activates it, the Warlord gets the hasted status. So this comes up more often than you would think. Medium range is a huge bubble. We might have made it too big. The reason we made it medium range is because we wanted a sit back and shoot Warlord to also be able to take advantage of it. But obviously you have a Warlord that's that's like going up with the melee characters. They're going to be in range for this to happen like all the time. Like it's going to trigger pretty frequently. So then your Warlord will pretty consistently be getting hasted. So if you built your Warlord to take advantage of that, honestly, every class in the game benefits from getting an extra action. This could be a really good choice. However, in playtesting, players almost always took skillful counters because denials are just so strong. When you really need to stop a key ability, you want to have to maximize your odds. I personally like predictable outcome more, but that's just me. They're two good choices. And really quickly too, I should have mentioned this at the beginning of the show, but we'll throw it in there. No action keyword can be used more than twice in the game. So even if you have 3 actions, which there is a cap of 3 standard actions, no matter how many buffs you have, you could, for example, melee attack 3 times. You couldn't cast a spell with 3 standard actions, etc. We did that for balance purposes. So what you can do is you can move, attack, or attack, move, attack, defend, etc. You just can't triple down. And we did that because it became oppressively powerful. In playtesting, when we didn't have that limitation, you would just try and spam haste as many times as you could, and you could, it became not fun, especially if you made a party of heroes that went at a very high initiative, so they would go before the other person went. You could oftentimes do so much damage, and it wasn't fun. At level 4, you get the options for reaching commands, which, as I already mentioned, it increases the range of Strike with Might and Halt to medium range. I'm sorry, Strike with Might and brace yourself and charge to medium range. And or you could take skillful commands, which will have Strike with Might or brace yourself applied to the Warlord in addition to the target allied model. Really, this comes down to if you want your Warlord to kind of operate at long range or not. If your Warlord's getting up in the mix and they're going to be fighting themselves or be like a backline fighter, like for example, if you built your Warlord to have like a pike so that they're like stabbing people from behind the fighter, they're going to be they don't have to worry about the range so much because they're close. And then getting the benefit for yourself is amazing. However, if you build a Warlord with like a crossbow or something like that, where they're going to be kind of a longer range, then getting the buff for yourself may not be so good, but being able to like affect an ally that's further away from you will be much more beneficial. So it really just depends on your style of play. At level 6, you get your choice between Blitzkrieg or Strike with All Your Might. Blitzkrieg lets you use Move with Haste on 2 targets, although it stuns you. I already covered this one. But basically, if you don't care if your Warlord's attacking too much, this is going to be a great choice because you could have 2 other heroes get an extra action. And then Strike with Might gives +1 power to, Strike with All Your Might gives Strike with Might +1 power. Really good if you're going to be using skillful commands as well, because then you're getting 2 additional power, 1 for the target model, 1 for your Warlord. And this is going to benefit a Warlord that's getting up in the mix and fighting himself more often. At level 8, you get Mass Halt, which lets you attempt to halt 2 target models, which again is stunning them, is taking an action away from them. You do this with the Unlucky Status effect, which increases the odds of failure on both rolls. Or you get Masterful Counters, which treats swirls as successes on the action dice. Both of these are incredibly good. It really just depends on if you want to have higher odds of stopping a key ability, or just trying to like slow down your opponent and take away actions from the monsters or enemy heroes in PvP. Playing Amara specifically, she's the Warlord in the core box. And again, the core box is kind of split 50-50, or it is split 50-50 between adherence to Zenith and Iconoclast, the good guys, bad guys, although it's morally gray. And she's the kind of the leader of the good guys, so to speak, in the core box. And she has kind of like a unique build. And I'll go through this in detail as we go, but so she's geared for offense primarily. She has good defense, although there are some gaps in her defense, which I'll cover. But really, she's built to take advantage of using as many skills and have as many options as possible. So first of all, she has really good offensive stats. She has accuracy and denial of 3. Denial is what you use counter strategy. Accuracy is for physical attacks, obviously. Those are very solid. She has a metaphysics of 2, which is when you're trying to use your commands offensively on an opposing model and you need to make an action roll. And she has a pretty good power of 2, so she can do decent damage with her javelin. Speaking of which, the javelin is a very versatile weapon. So a javelin has the throw keyword, which means it's a very, very powerful keyword. It means the weapon can be used as a melee weapon or as a ranged weapon. So you can throw it at medium range, or you can stab with it in melee. So it only does 3 damage, which is on the lower end, but otherwise, it would be an auto take weapon otherwise if it did more, because the versatility to be a ranged and melee weapon is just really strong. So it allows her to operate at kind of any range band that you want. You can charge in with her and stab with the javelin, or you can hang back and throw. It lets you play her as either a melee or ranged Warlord, right? It's up to you. Defensively, she has a pretty good HP of 15. It's not bad. She has an excellent evasion of 6, and this because she has a medium shield. So she's pretty hard to hit. She has a will and fortitude of 3, which are both respectable. Neither one of those is bad. But she has no armor. So what she has in her armor slot is class garb. Class garb doesn't give you any defense, but it lets you take an extra class skill. So speaking of which, and as I mentioned earlier, she has 5 class skills, which is it's a ton. That means that she gets every class skill available to her at level 1 and level 2. And generally, she's going to get an extra general skill as well, because she'll have more class skill slots than she even has class skills available until she starts to level up. So it's not even until she gets to, I believe, like level 6 that she even has to make a choice as to what class skills she's going to put in her deck. She just gets all of them by default because she has so many skills available to her. So this allows you to play her like you have tons of options, right? So again, she's a little fragile. She's hard to hit, but you can function at any range band. You can go into melee, although you typically only want to do it to finish off a monster or to engage with chaff monsters. She's super fast with a movement of 6, so she can get into position to be where you think she's going to do the most damage. She can run after objectives. She has a medium range weapon, so she's really, really, really versatile. Really, the only glaring weakness, as I mentioned, is that she has no armor. However, she does have the shield, and what the shield does is not only give you a static increase to your evasion, it also gives you the block action. The block action is hands down the best active defense in the game. So all active defense, meaning you choose to do it, comes with a downside. The downside is it gives you the hobbled status effect, meaning in your next action you'll move at half speed. With movement 6, it's not that bad though. But what it does is any action, any offensive action that targets you in your front arc, you get to block. Blocking roughly reduces the damage by half. And unlike parrying, which only works in melee, blocking works against ranged weapons, and it can be used against spells that don't do raw damage. So it's very versatile. And in a pinch, if she does get hit, she's always got her shield to reduce incoming damage. But you don't want to rely on it because she can't take that many hits. So as stated, she's really quick, and you want to be thinking how to position her to be in the best spot to issue the right commands at the right time, right? So because you're frequently going to be throwing your javelin, you're going to use one action to move. She's very mobile. And you're going to use another action to attack, and then you're going to give somebody an extra, the bonus action. So you want to think, where am I going to get the most mileage out of this? And then you're going to use your other command to either stun an enemy or have a key ally increase their defense because you don't want them to get knocked out, or you know a bunch of monsters are going to charge them, or to increase their offense, whatever. Like, you have tons of options. That's why she's so fun to play. But in playtesting, a lot of the times players try to play her like a melee character and just get in the mix and try and do a lot of damage. And, you know, she can, but I think she's better played in a support role personally. Also, as her heritage is she's an ancestral elf. She comes from the savannas of Tamba. This gives her access to the very good heritage skill, which is called Skilled. What this does is before you declare an action, you play the card, and then you have the lucky status effect for the duration of that action. The lucky status effect lets you reroll any die in the dice pool after rolling. So if you had a critical failure or something like that, you can re-roll it. It just increases your odds of getting a successful action. So a fun little lore tidbit for you in Bloodthrone. Elves don't live longer than everybody else. So in the game, we have the Accords. These are the laws, kind of like the 10 Commandments of the game, so to speak. That was set down by Zenith. She's the creator goddess of the world. No sentient being, we call them Kith. That's like the catch-all phrase for them. No Kith can live beyond 120 years. Like, that's the dictate laid down. Elves, on the other hand, of the big three, like the main three, like the sort of the starter races, like the first three that were created, which were human, elves, and dwarves. Dwarves live the longest, but they're the slowest. Humans are in the middle. Elves, unlike most fantasy settings where they live forever, basically, or thousands of years, which I always felt that was so weird because you get one Alexander the Great elf and he conquered the world, But my personal bias aside, the elves in Bloodthrone burn hot. They have like a really high metabolism, but they live shorter life. Their natural lifespan is typically shorter than a human, definitely than a dwarf. But in exchange, that's why they have movement 6, right? So elves are live fast, die young, and stay, leave a pretty corpse. In our lore, they stay youthful up until the very end, and then the wheels kind of come off the bus really quick. They age rapidly, and then they die. So elves in Bloodthrone, they're like brash, and they live loud, and they pack a lot of life into the years that they get because they know that they're not going to get as many years as everybody else. And because we tried to tie it into to biology as well, like in the real world, animals that move slowly live longer, right? Like turtles, and the oldest known living animal in the world is a deep water shark, and I think it's like near Greenland. It's like 400 years old. And the thing, it moves slowly, right? It conserves energy. So we wanted to kind of make it feel realistic from a biology perspective as well. Anyway, I won't go too far into it, but in the lore of the big three, and this is mirrored throughout all of the heritages, which is what we call races. Things that move slower live longer. Things that move fast they go hot, but they don't go as long, right? So elves, that's why they have movement 6, and then they have abilities that reflect this. So we also, as a balance issue, so as an aside, forgive me, I'm kind of go off on a tangent here. The heritages that have low movement tend to have better heritage skills. We wanted it to match the lore, but also to be more powerful to offset the fact that they're slower. And then the heritages that were faster, like elves, because being faster is just an inherently great benefit, tend to have less powerful heritage skills. I just want to throw that out there as an explanation. So when building your own warlord, as I've said already, really the main question is how do you want them to play on the tabletop? So as you get better at the game, like you'll start thinking about overall party composition. Like, okay, do I need an off tank? Do I need a secondary tank? Like someone that can go stand and take a punch in case my main tank isn't available for this game, or if I feel like there's going to be an overwhelming amount of offense and I need 2 people that can stand out there and just take a punch. Well, you can build your warlord to do that, right? Give a medium armor, medium shield, hand weapon, go in, take skillful commands. You give brace yourself to your main tank and your secondary tank, and you can build this wall of 2 characters that are really, really hard to shift. And then your warlord's up there issuing commands and defending themselves effectively, and they're like the second most durable character in your roster outside of your main tank. Or you can build them offensively, like I said, like a mini barbarian, where they dual wield and they're up in the mix, or they take a 2-handed weapon and they're kind of like standing right behind the main offensive characters. Or you can build them with a ranged weapon where they stand back. Maybe they have light armor or no armor, and they're still very effective. They can still do quite a bit of damage if you put points into perception and power. And they're like almost like the ranger, right? Like they're doing quite a bit of damage from range, moving into position, and again issuing those commands with reaching commands, like they're doing it at longer range. There's a ton of ways you can build them. You have a tremendous amount of flexibility and options in how you build your warlord. So you just really want to think in advance, what do I want them to do? And then of course, also, how do I want them to look, right? So in a miniatures game, that plays a big part in it. Maybe you have a really, really cool model that you want to, that you really want to use, and you couldn't kind of think of where else it wanted to be, or you wanted your leader character to be your favorite model. And with the warlord, you have a ton of flexibility in how to reflect that on the tabletop. So once you make that decision, everything else kind of falls into place, with feats and skill selections that you're going to be taking, because it's going to depend on where the warlord is located in space on the tabletop. One of the main challenges you'll find with a class like the warlord, is very similarly to the inquisitor when we get to that one, is that because they do so many different things, you really feel spread thin on your stat points. So like oftentimes you want them to be able to punch. So you need to put points into power and perception. But you also want them to be able to take a punch. You want to put points into constitution, which increases your hit points, and evasion. So you feel like, gosh, I want to put points everywhere. It's like, but I also want to put points into my ability to deny other special abilities. So you want to have a higher resolve. And then I need to put points into intelligence so I have lots of skills. And so that's the challenge of playing the warlord. And it's also the fun of playing the warlord. So in playtesting, we sometimes would just say, like, you know what? My warlord's not going to do any fighting. I'm just going to focus on making them really hard to kill. And I'm going to focus on issuing commands and denying abilities. So they're kind of like this little like tank that walks forward and does no damage, but is annoying because they stops your opponents or the monster's key abilities. And they're just like focusing on giving those commands out. You can do that. Do the opposite. They're really flexible. They're really, really flexible. And I think once you become competent with the rules and familiar with the game, it will become one of the most fun classes to play, because you have so much freedom to express creativity in the way you build it out. Well, thanks for joining me again for this episode of Making the Game. I hope you found it insightful. If there's a class you would like for me to cover next, let me know. Like I said, the next podcast is probably just me a general update. I want to do a deep dive into what's going on in the development cycle, why we are having probably a couple months delay. I don't want anybody to think we haven't been working hard. We've been working our butts off. the delays are almost exclusively because we've been invested into making a better product. So hopefully that no one's upset about that. It's not like there's nothing catastrophic. It's just like mostly it's just adding tons and tons of art to the game. But I'll do a deep dive into that, and also why we have a delay on this Sundrop paint upgrade. It's the dang shipment got to my door and then the guy left. I have no idea what's going on. It's bizarre. So it was going back to Indiana. I'm like, what the heck is going on? It's utterly bizarre, but we have a solution for that. At any rate, we'll cover that in the next one. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it. Please consider backing the game if you have not already over at GameFound, and we will talk to you next time.